To find out who would love him when he had nothing, the richest man in the city chose to become the poorest. The photographer's flash caught the moment the cake shattered, 3 tears collapsing like a white avalanche, dollops of frosting in the bride's hair, guests shifting from stunned silence to cruel laughter. The grand ballroom of Gu House, all crystal and orchids, folded into an awkward hush, then a choir of whispers. Evelyn Gu stood frozen at the center of a public unraveling, her veil askew, while cameras hungrily harvested every expression. Headlines would eat this whole scene for breakfast. Adrian Long watched from the edge of the crowd, an island of calm in a sea of scandal. He was a man who had learned to be unreadable. Decades at the helm of Long Industries had taught him how to make his face the last place anyone found an honest response. Tonight, everyone expected spectacle. He'd been invited as an honored guest precisely because his name implied certainty, but he had not come for pomp. He had come to observe. Later, in a car that smelled faintly of expensive leather and policy, his chauffeur drove him away from the camera glare. The headlines would call this another of the Gu family's social disasters. Adrian thought of something else. Watching the bride's half-laughing, half-humiliated answer to the crowd, watching how quickly faces rearranged to suit status, he felt an old, familiar ache. He had had everything, and still he did not know whether the smiles around him were for him or for his balance sheet. "I need to know who would love me if I walked in without a suit, without a name," he said to Daniel, his assistant, in the tinted privacy of the sedan. Daniel, younger, eager, and prone to bracing platitudes, looked at him like a man who'd been given a strange, dangerous coin. "It's a cruel experiment," Daniel said. "People get hurt." Adrian's jaw tightened. He was not blind to that. The city had given him power and accord. The city had also taught him that power reshapes the mirror people hold up to themselves. There was a man he had been before power taught him to count affection like contracts, and he wanted to know if that man could still choose honestly. "I won't make the test public," he said. "No spectacle. I'll play something small, a bodyguard perhaps, poor clothes, fewer assumptions." "Make sure it doesn't backfire," Daniel warned. "Some of these circles would tear someone apart." Adrian smiled without warmth. "That's why you will help me make it look convincing." So he gave himself away, not in the sense of surrendering everything. He kept his companies, his assets, the tidy lines of power, but he folded one small part of himself into a costume, calluses that weren't his, a poor man's jacket borrowed from a theater, a fake name, and a job no one who needed to know about would expect of him.
He would step into an experiment, blind date-style encounters disguised as a humble protector, a man hired to stand in the background, observed rather than adored. It felt like the last honest thing to try. Meanwhile, across the river, in a block of faded brick and narrow alleys, Sasha's son was coaxing a new accord into being from a handful of rare oils. Her workshop was a sliver of warmth. Shelves of amber bottles, strips of absorbent paper curled at the edges, the small incense of bergamot and rosehip hanging in the air like a secret. She had been a promising student at the Academy of Scenting. She had once worked under a Master Nose's mentorship, until a scandal, an accusation of plagiarism that ought never to have stuck, had unraveled her career. At 30, with the glass door of professional salons shut against her, she made perfumes in private and sold them in a corner of the weekend market, where people with good noses and thinner wallets found her. Sasha's hands moved with a precision that looked effortless. She spoke softly to her work, measuring smelling notes like someone naming children. A citrus top note gave way to a spicy heart that lingered like a memory. When she closed her eyes to inhale, something in her face softened. She loved what she did the way other people loved breath. She also carried something else, the steady ache of betrayal. She had been plastered across gossip columns as someone who stole a formula from a mentor, accused by a woman with connections and a talent for rumor. Evidence had been scant, but in the court of public opinion, doubt was often enough to ruin a life. Sasha had lost investors, invitations, a storefront lease. She had kept her head up, kept making sense that felt like small acts of defiance. If she could not be the celebrated perfumer the city wanted, she would be the perfumer who refused to stop creating. That stubbornness was what made her beautiful to watch. The morning Adrian first saw her was the kind of day the city calls ordinary, and this was the moment that the experiment started to have a heartbeat outside his planning. He was not supposed to meet her yet. He was supposed to be background, a bodyguard position arranged as a quiet favor for an acquaintance with too many enemies. But fate and the slim, magnetizing logic of stories stitched a meeting anyway. He was Lin Wei now, cap pulled low, jacket patchy, a cheap watch that ticked with the wrong kind of cherished persistence. He stood near a boutique where a charity event overflowed with silk and champagne, watching the room for clues on human kindness. Women in myrrh-scented gowns stepped over puddles of spent napkins. Men in tailored jackets practiced smiles that were inventory. A socialite cornered a newcomer to see how she would respond to Prestige's blade. When a girl in an expensive dress tripped on a loose step and an older man scolded her in public, Lin Wei moved without thinking. He reached out to steady her hand.
The woman recoiled from him, not from his touch, but from the idea of him. The crowd snickered. Sasha had been at the market that morning, selling a small batch of second-chance samples, an ironic name she had given to the scent that had once been her greatest hope, and then, somehow, her greatest misfortune. She arrived late to the boutique because the bus had been delayed, and because running a small stand and a small dream kept her tethered to 2 clocks. She did not dress like the women inside the event, no gowns or jewelry, hair pulled back with practical pins, but she carried herself as if she had the right to be somewhere without asking. The socialite who had been scolded recognized her from a competition years ago, and on impulse or cruelty made a rude comment about how the perfume market was full of amateurs like her. The laughter that followed was meant to be compact and dismissive. Sasha smiled anyway, a small, careful curve meant to deflect. Most people would not notice how tired it made her. Lin Wei bristled at the laughter. He was not supposed to be protective in any public way, only to observe, to keep distance. Tests needed untainted reactions. But Sasha's face when the joke landed told a story better than any of Adrian's spreadsheets. There was no bargaining in it, no scheming, just the kind of humiliation that had nowhere to land except back into the body. Lin Wei crossed the space between them and said something small and steady that made the sting less. "Not everyone here is a trend," he told the socialite, low and plainly. "Some people are still making." The room shifted. The socialite, caught off guard by the tom, coughed and stammered a mock apology. The mood changed not because of wealth, but because someone refused to play along with the mockery. Sasha looked at Lin Wei as if seeing a window opened in a sealed room. She nodded. That small act would, later, make Adrian rewrite his plain rules. The study had become a life. After the boutique, Adrian began the experiment in earnest. He arranged dates that were not performances but setups, small interactions where he could be introduced as a hired protector or an unnoticed attendant. He wanted to see how women behaved around a man who had nothing to gain by being flattering, who could be shrugged off by circumstance, but might be chosen for reasons that had nothing to do with bank statements. At the darts bar, a group of young heiresses tossed coins and insults around him like confetti. He let it slide, taking their jibes like soft rain, measuring their amusement. At a community dance where a tango went wrong and a partner collapsed with a shoe disaster, he stepped in and led the embarrassed woman off the floor without making a joke of it. At a mall, an entitled shopper tried to bribe him to move a queue. He refused with a shrug that was almost a bow. The tests were small, designed to scrub off the glitter and watch what remained.
And Sasha was there in more than one of those moments. Sometimes she was a bystander who handed him a paper cup of tea when his coat was damp from rain. Sometimes she was the one who refused to sell him a frayed scarf for more than its worth, because charity, in her book, could not be a price on someone's dignity. The city watches small things. Intention is easier to read in an unforced hand. Adrian began to notice details that were not data points for a boardroom presentation, but soft claims made in the margins of life. Sasha wore a scent that was not loud, something like rain on hot concrete, with a thread of jasmine, an honest perfume, not a stone hurled to announce itself. She kept a battered notebook with a list of accords and a crooked sketch of a bottle she hoped would be one day. When she laughed, it was brief, like a light finding its way through a thin curtain. Daniel, who had agreed to help maintain the ruse, started to fidget. He saw the experiment changing Adrian in ways that were not neat. "You're not supposed to fall for the test," Daniel said one night as they stood outside a cheap noodle shop, sharing cigarettes to keep warm. "You're supposed to collect results." Adrian inhaled smoke and exhaled something that tasted like fatigue. "Maybe I am collecting something different," he admitted. "Maybe a feeling." "You're playing with people's lives." "I know." The confession sat heavily between them. "I don't want to hurt them." "You already are," Daniel said, blunt and worried. "Even walking in that jacket is an assumption." It was true. The moral ledger of the experiment grew complex the more Adrian stepped into hands that were not used to being kept. He had told himself that the test was meant to strip away the artifice and find truth. But truth is like glass, beautiful and fragile and easy to cut. He began to sleep less, dream more. He found himself at Sasha's stall more than he had any business being, pretending to browse oils while feeling like a child peeking into a life where he must not be seen. Sasha noticed him, of course. She noticed the way his hands, even when men looked like they belonged in them, never sat quite still. She noticed the careful distance he maintained, the way he never quite let her know where he was from or what he had. When she asked his name once to make small talk, he offered up Lynn. That was enough. A name is often the only coin people ask for, and sometimes the only one they accept. There were pleasant moments that the experiment did not anticipate. A shared spoon of soup on a rain-slick sidewalk after a talked-about gala had emptied. A conversation about the one rare ingredient Sasha desired, ambrette seed from a southern island, and a surprising money-saving suggestion Adrian made that was not condescending but practical.
There were also missteps, whispers behind her back from patrons who had once been clients and were now distant, a suitor who assumed they would sleep together after one night and was cruelly disappointed when she refused. Adrian watched these missteps as both a protector and a confessor, sometimes acting with a quiet grace to smooth an insult, sometimes simply standing silent and letting her prove herself. Within his company, the experiment was an open secret to only a couple of people. Daniel bristled and then learned to be more careful. Mrs. Ong, the elderly member of Long Industries' household staff who had known Adrian when he was a young man, argued with him one morning in the corporate kitchen. "You are making it worse," she said, offering him a cup of tea and not speaking like an order. "People will hurt the one who has already been hurt." Adrian looked at the steam spiral up from the cup and saw something like apology in it. "I will bear that," he said. "I can afford to bear it." "Then you already do not need the test," she replied, and for once Adrian had no answer. Meanwhile, the world that had pushed Sasha out of its salons did not forget the face of betrayal so easily. Vivian Wong, razor-sharp, privileged by a family and a reputation that made other women's ruins into her trophies, had watched Sasha's quiet work and smiled to herself. If the city likes one kind of drama, it is the drama of a former favorite being cheap and proving them right. Vivian had her own reasons beyond amusement. A perfume brand she'd been developing needed a face that wouldn't rouse suspicion. Sasha could be a scapegoat to be reclaimed later, if the timing and narrative were right. The contest that would change everything was announced with the kind of ceremony that makes careers, the city's annual Grand Accord, a perfume competition judged by a jury of elderly masters whose noses had been roughly trained by a different era. It was the kind of event that either opens a door or slams one. Sasha, who had spent months concocting a scent she called Comeback, sent her application with a trembling hope and a practiced restraint that came from years of not letting herself hope too loudly. The contest required a technical dossier, scent notes, inspiration, a demonstration vial. It would give her the legitimacy she had been denied if she was allowed past the first scrutiny. Among the people who read her application were two kinds of readers, those who would see the talent and those who would see the threat. Vivian Wong read and counted threats where the dossier showed promise. She remembered the scandal that had derailed Sasha. Too convenient, too exploitable. Out of this memory, a stalking plan took shape, cruel and quiet. If she could discredit Sasha publicly, she would remove a rival and sow another cautionary tale into the city's collective conscience.
Adrian found out about the contest through channels he had built for fewer humane reasons, because market trends inform decisions, because an upstart perfumer changing market share could be an asset or a liability. Daniel, who navigated press and influence like a man who had spent his life spinning plates, told him in an offhand voice that sounded false even as it was informative. "She's entered the Grand Accord," Daniel said. "Son, Sasha's son." Adrian felt something unclench in his chest. "Let me go," he said before he could think about whether that was foolish. He wanted to be present, whether by accident or choice, to see the moment she had been denied once more. "You can't," Daniel said. "You're not supposed to be at these things as yourself. You have to remain Lynn." Adrian looked at his assistant, the argument no longer abstract. "I know." "What will you do if someone tries to sabotage her?" Daniel asked. "You can't let people—" "I'll watch," Adrian said. The word was less passive than it sounded. "I'll watch and I'll step in where I can anonymously. I will not—" He stopped. The truth was that if the contest became the stage for a public ruin, he could not stand aside. He also could not reveal himself without ending the experiment. The mechanics of his deception were suddenly an ethical knot that tightened like a noose. Sasha spent nights revising her presentation, calming herself with small rituals, tapping the sides of vials, tracing the label's curve, rehearsing the story she would tell the judges about how the scent was born from a rainy morning on a roof. She had already prepared for the catcalls. She had grown a shell against them,
but she could not prepare for organized, thoughtful cruelty masked as critique. She knew how the city loved narratives that made someone small. When the day of the pre-selection came, the organizers asked contestants to arrive with their samples sealed. Judges would evaluate blind. That was the point of the exercise, purportedly. The older judges prided themselves on removing the artist's name and looking only at the scent. But in a world where cameras are omnipresent, and where reputations are traded like currency, blind tests can still be gamed, rumors can be planted, and malicious hands can find weak points in any security. Vivian spoke in the right rooms the right lies. A story that implied Sasha had been tainted before the first sniff would be easy to insinuate and harder to dispel. She did what people like her always do. She set the narrative stage and let others move around her props. Adrian had his own small team. Mrs. Ong and Daniel worked nights to pull together what he asked for. Anonymized facts, last-minute careering of a sample that might pass an expert scrutiny, a quiet man in the back row to make sure no one tampered with sealed files. He set up safeguards as best he could without ending the experiment.
But the city is a theater where all props can be tampered and all wings hold secret exits. Adrian had to accept that his experiment might expose Sasha to a new wound in order to validate a truth he wanted, and that truth might not be worth the cost. On the morning of the pre-selection, Sasha walked into the hall with a carton of her vials, her hands encased in gloves the way a surgeon treats a patient. The auditorium smelled of coffee and backstage adrenaline. Contestants whispered of their notes like lovers boasting of conquests. Sasha felt small but clear. She had nothing to hide, and she had already learned how to carry shame without letting it define the width of her life. Adrian watched from the area where Lin Wei was supposed to be invisible. A security lane, a checklist of names, a man in a plain jacket who kept watch. He watched the contestants file in, the polished brands with their press kits, the up-and-comers with their glossy dreams, the one or two famous noses who always swaggered like worn kings. He watched Sasha place her vial on the counter with hands that did not tremble as much as he expected. The auditorium's tone shifted subtly. Some people turned their heads to take her in. He also noticed a man in an unremarkable suit who lingered too long near the registration desk. He had the poised hush of someone used to making worlds unmake themselves with a single whisper. Adrian recognized him instantly by the exactness of his footsteps. Vivian's fixer. He watched the man flash a message on his phone and hand something, a small folded thing, to an usher who tucked it into an envelope and nodded like he'd been paid for that nod. Adrian's stomach tightened. Protocols can fail because of human greed, and because human greed comes with hands that will find a lock unnoticed. He could intervene now with a gentle word, reveal the trick, challenge the man, call down a scandal that would ruin someone he still wanted to protect. Or he could let the system unfurl, watch where it leads, and trust that the truth he sought would be worth the possible rupture. He chose to trust the other parts of his plan, cameras in the hall, a discreet backup file he had arranged to be placed near the judges' table, and for the first time he felt the old anxiety that comes when you are half-parent to someone else's fate. He had not anticipated how much being invisible would make him bleed. When the pre-selection began, the vials were opened and presented under the judges' sniffing hoods. Education and habit led the masters to close their eyes and let the scent tell them its story. Sasha leaned back against the table and tried to breathe like a person who had always been taught to wait. She had no allies in the room who would speak her name unless her scent spoke loud enough.
At the very moment the judges reached for her vial, a subtle, almost professional hand slipped something into the sample set, an odd, faint film that would not be noticed until someone else leaned closer. It was the sort of sabotage that looked accidental until someone took a second, more patient sniff and realized the accord had been altered by a foreign note. Bitterness where there should have been warmth. A cloying note that had no place in Sasha's composition. Adrian saw the movement from his vantage point and felt as if the world narrowed into the tiny piece of paper that the man in the suit had passed over. He could have stormed forward, torn the envelope, exposed the fix, but the experiment was live. If he revealed himself, the reaction he had come to measure would be lost in the spectacle of his confession. The truth he sought would be drowned by the revelation of his identity. He held back. Instead, he made a different choice. He sent a silent message, one that he hoped would be enough. A short text to Daniel to check the archive cameras, to the house to ensure that nothing was missing, to Mrs. Ong to be ready at the back door. Then, with the careful patience of someone who had spent a fortune learning to wait for the right time to strike, he watched the judges raise their eyebrows. Sasha met the judges' puzzled faces and said nothing. There was a concordance in her expression that Adrian found wrenching. She accepted scrutiny with the dignity of someone who had way too often been assumed guilty and had been forced to carry that badge of guilt like a coat she could never remove. The pre-selection panel murmured, made notes, and flagged her bottle for a second test.
Outside, as the competition's committee moved into a quieter room to deliberate, Vivian Wong allowed herself a smile that was composed like a stamp of doom. She had done something smaller than ruin tonight. She had planted a seed of suspicion. That might be enough to push a talented but vulnerable soul out of the running. Adrian walked out into the corridor and found a quiet place near the service stairwell. He leaned against the cold wall and let the weight of a promise settle in his chest. He would not let her be ruined by his experiment. He would not be the cause of someone's fall. To protect her and keep the test, he told himself, he would have to engineer a different kind of reveal, one not public, not theatrical. He would gather facts and evidence. He would use what power he had without showing his face. The decision felt like walking a high wire. He had chosen a path that would ask of him both patience and sacrifice, to remain Lin while becoming a shadow that would thwart shadows. He had not calculated how much of himself he would give away in the process. Back in the workshop, Sasha closed the lid on a sample vial.
She had read the judges' faces as well as anyone could read them. They had tasted what she had made and found it true but tainted in someone else's eyes. She had been prepared for this possibility. She had not been prepared for the feeling of being observed by something other than suspicion, a man in a coat whose eyes had lingered on her with something like consideration. She left the hall when the committees convened, a small box of vials in her bag, and the world already leaning toward one of its favorite stories, that individuals who fall can only ever fall again. A car door sighed open and shut as people left with their conclusions. The city hummed its indifferent soundtrack. But beneath that, the cogs had been set in motion. The fixture of a test, the orbit of an experiment, and the careful, dangerous work of someone who would pretend to be poor to learn whether anyone would love him when he had nothing. If this kind of story is the kind of thing that keeps you watching, subscribe to follow the twists. There's much more coming. For now, the quiet before the storm lengthened. The grand accord would take place in weeks, and the city's rumor mill began to taste blood. Sasha returned to her worn bench in a small room above a noodle shop and began to refine the scent that could or break her. Adrian, taking on the mantle of Lin, watched from the periphery and arranged protections that would not reveal his hand. A backup vial in a sealed courier, a cameraman who would sit disguised in the third row, a note in a folder that would be delivered if anything went wrong. Both of them moved through days that would later be stitched into memory, the perfumer obsessing over heart notes and fixatives, the man in a patched jacket learning to fold his hands in ways that made him invisible. Both of them held secrets, Sasha the quiet want of being believed, Adrian the truth about who he was and why he had chosen to be poor. The city, always hungry for a story, began to whisper about the strange bodyguard who had started appearing around small public acts of kindness. He drew both scorn and curiosity, the kind of polarized attention that either makes or breaks reputations. He was, in the gossip's language, a curiosity. To Adrian, he was protection and test, and also the beginning of an ache he did not yet name. He told himself it was necessary, but necessity does not always grant absolution. At the end of the week before the pre-selection final, a courier found Sasha outside her shop. He handed her an envelope marked simply, "Invitation. Press conference the next day." Inside was a polite, unsigned note suggesting she might step aside for the greater good. It smelled faintly of old money and new threats. She folded the paper and put it in the pocket where she kept extra safety pins. Adrian watched that exchange from across the street. Lin Wei folded his hands and did not move.
He turned the matter over in his head like a man turning a stone to find a hidden coin. Rules bent under him, but the line between protecting and manipulating frayed like an old rope. He would have to be careful. He had to stop those who wanted to use her as a cautionary tale without exposing himself. That would mean doing what he had always hated, pulling levers from behind the curtain. But he also knew something else. The only way he would forgive himself for becoming Lin was if he offered Sasha something real when the experiment ended. He would give her more than a rescue or a confession. He would give her a chance to choose him with open eyes. That promise secured him. It did not, however, make the choice easier. Late that night, as rain polished the city's glass, something small and sharp slid into the envelope of another man in the contest's organizing committee.
a smear on a sample that looked like an accident but would speak like a lie. The fix was in motion. Two people, one misfortune away from ruin and one about to be forced into revealing everything to save their name, would find themselves bending toward each other with all the force of a pull that had been quietly set into motion. Adrian stood in the shadow and watched the envelope change hands. In a week, the judges' noses would decide more than sense. They would decide whether a talented, betrayed girl would be allowed to stand again, whether a man who pretended to be poor in search of honest love could be forgiven for the deception he had chosen. The week that followed moved like a held breath. The grand accord drew closer, gossip tightened into strategy, and the city's appetite for spectacle sharpened. Adrian kept his routine of small disappearances, Lynn's cheap jacket, Lynn's low-bowed hat, and returned each night to his suite of plans. He had asked Daniel and Mrs. Ong to act like conspirators in a play whose final act he still hesitated to watch. They obeyed with the stubborn, practical loyalty of people who had seen the price of his choices and chose to pay a little of it for him. Sasha, meanwhile, worked as though she had been given a single week to rebuild every ruined year. She refined her comeback formula until even the mundane notes were taut with intent. A top of bright bergamot that opened like a polite apology, a heart of ambrette and rose that remembered warmth, a base of smoked vetiver and soft musk that lingered like a promise not to disappear. She adjusted concentrations, tried different fixatives, and paced in the small room above the noodle shop until the light from the street lamp softened the jagged edges of her nerves. On the night before the final selection, Adrian caught sight of her across an alley as she carried a crate of vials under a rain umbrella. She was soaked to the knees, hair flattened, but she walked with a straightness that made him want to hand her a coat and a title. He did neither.
He merely crossed the distance between them as Lynn offered to help hoist the crate, and felt his hand brush the nape of her neck when she leaned to lift it, an intimacy accidental and devastating. She did not look at him in a way that betrayed understanding. She looked at him like someone noticing a small kindness and filing it away. "You'll get sick," he said, too aware of how his voice sounded. "I'll get a scent that remembers the air," she answered, and there was a wry humor there that admitted defeat and habit at once. "Thanks, Lynn. Good luck tomorrow," he added, because everything he had been doing was an attempt to manufacture luck for her. He wanted to tell her the truth then, wanted to fold himself into explanation and ask for permission to have been a flaw in her story. But the experiment had rules he had promised himself to uphold. Watch, record, learn. Some promises are cowardice in silk shirts. He told himself he would earn the right to confess later, after she had the chance to choose without the weight of his name. The final selection was staged like a quiet coronation. The hall was a contrast of hush and fever. Judges sat like old kings with napkin-folded hands, journalists preened under the quiet thread of scoops, and young noses hovered with the fragile arrogance of hope. Sasha's hands did not shake as she placed her sealed vial on the designated tray. Her sample smelled of rain-wild jasmine held inside paper, of rooftop mornings, and the faint smell of the noodle shop's broth below her room. Adrian watched her from the back, a plain jacket among 1,000 more plain jackets, recording only what he needed for his work. He watched her go through the ritual of being judged, an act she had performed too often in the wrong rooms, and he felt a tightness that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with the fear of being the reason she tripped. The judges took the vials in order, noses dipping, lids raised, closed eyes convulsing slightly as memory met chemistry. Some profiles registered immediately, a judge's face contorted at a false base, another straightened at an honest heart. Sasha's vial passed hands and arrived at the bench of Master Liang, a man whose nose was the stuff of legends, whose blunt opinions could open or shutter careers. Liang sniffed, closed his eyes, and held his breath like a man who might change his mind if he waited one more moment. For a while the process unfolded in the way tradition intended, merit, not rumor, dictating outcome. But Vivian Wang was patient and precise. Her people were the opposite of dramatic. They sowed small disasters and waited for them to swell. Somewhere between the round of sniffs and the quiet note-taking, a small flurry of commotion rippled across the stage. A judge opened a vial that had been tampered with. Another judge winced. Someone shuffled papers in a voice too loud. Sasha felt the change like static, Attention peeled from her scent and landed on the idea of contamination. When Master Leon called for a pause, the room's air seemed to shrink. Vivian's face, calm as glass, thought the pause a success, suspicion worth a scandal. She let others talk, allowed whispers to become a narrative. There was something inconsistent in the handling, she suggested sweetly to anyone who would listen. Perhaps this industry needs stricter protocols. The chairman ordered samples resealed and checked. A technician opened the vials again and found, tucked between the inner seal and Sasha's glass, a faint film, so thin it could have slipped in by accident, but perfect in its timing. The panel murmured about contamination and procedural error. They asked Sasha to step aside while technicians verified chain of custody logs. Cameras caught the moment and fed it to the real court, the public. Adrian felt the air turn on him. His plan had been to watch, to guard discreetly, to channel resources subtly. He had not planned to watch the ruin play out under lights that meant money. He had not planned for his experiment to put someone he had come to care for under the very blade he wanted to test. He had thought he could shield her without becoming the specter of involvement. That calculus crumbled in the light of the technician's careful fingers lifting a tainted paper. He moved. Not by revealing himself, he still believed the experiment deserved a finish line, but by drawing a thread from behind the stage. Daniel and Mrs. Ong found each other in shadowed corridors, and Adrian passed a stuffed envelope through a courier everyone assumed belonged to the competition staff. The envelope contained an alternate sample streaked with the same scent profile as Sasha's original, a vial left in the care of a vendor Adrian's people had had the good sense to bribe with nothing more than kindness, a man who owed them a favor and had no interest in headlines. It was a risk born of desperate logic. In the hush of the judge's deliberation, the spare sample was placed before Master Leong by a nameless hand. He tasted and frowned. The spare matched except for one note too bright, a surreptitious mouthful of bitterness someone had tried to add to be original. The suspicious film could be replicated. It was not inherent to Sasha's composition. Leong's brow smoothed with the weight of indecision, which was itself a kind of mercy. He asked for a recheck. Vivian, seeing the tide waver, chose not to leave it to chance. Her fixer, the man with the exact steps, slipped again into a backstage corridor and pocketed the empty vial from the display table. He moved like a shadow meant to look like a man running errands. He planned next stage, a whisper campaign to the papers, a quote here, a suggestive rumor there. He would not need much. A seed of doubt, properly sown, could germinate into a forest of suspicion.
Adrian watched this movement through Daniel's eyes. "We have to stop him," Daniel hissed, every muscle taut with the compulsion of someone who'd kept plates spinning his whole life. Adrian considered exposing the fixer publicly, a scene that would involve him stepping forward and saying, "I am Adrian Long, and I will not have this woman ruined." That would stop the sabotage. It would also stop the experiment forever. He wanted to know who would choose him if he had nothing. But as the seconds ticked and the judges debated, the stakes shifted from experiment to rescue. The line he had put in the sand blurred. He chose, again, to act from shadow. He instructed a camera operator, planted earlier as a supposed student journalist, a man who months earlier had owed Adrian a favor, to follow the fixer. The man trailed him to the loading dock and caught, in shaky footage, the fixer slipping the empty vial into a back pocket and meeting an usher who accepted an envelope in exchange for a nod. That footage, grainy and inadvertent, was Adrian's key. Daniel worked his network like a man defusing a bomb. He obtained timestamps, courier logs, and an inconspicuous receipt from a cafe where the fixer had paused that morning. Each small artifact was a thread. Together, when presented in the right order, they formed a chain that made intent visible. On the judge's callback to the stage, the chairman announced a suspension while evidence was double-checked. Reporters pounced, cameras flashed, Sasha's face was captured in close-up, controlled but hollow. A column of comments lit up social feeds. Some offered sympathy, others already pronounced her guilty, proof being the only currency many had taught themselves to accept. The city's appetite for stories was not for the interesting, but the resolved. Ambiguity made the rumor mill spin. Adrian could have stepped forward. He could have ended it there, with a dramatic unmasking and a confession that would have rendered this week a brilliant, if morally messy, success. He did not. Not yet. He wanted the judges to clear her without his name tipping the scale. He wanted the world to see her rise on her own terms.
But when the chairman, pressured and pestered by voices with different interests, suggested a provisional disqualification pending an investigation, Adrian stopped pretending he could stay out of the weather. A woman's career, fragile and rebounding, hung balanced on the choice of people who had already chosen to value spectacle over talent. There was a line between the experiment's logic and the cruelty of omission. Adrian had chosen the latter momentarily to preserve the former. He could not live with that choice if it sacrificed Sasha. So he stepped forward, still as Lynn, but he used the voice of someone who would not be ignored.
At the back of the crowded hall, a security guard recorded a jostled scrap of footage that showed a man who had exchanged the courier envelope near a vendor Adrian's team had co-opted. The guard's deposit, anonymous and unpolished, made its way to the chairman. Daniel, in a carefully timed maneuver, arranged for the chairman to see the footage. The chairman's face sank. He called the technical staff, compared seals, and finally made the decision to reopen chain of custody reviews. The technicians found discrepancies. The inner seals had been broken. One of the courier stamps had a smudge that matched a man's cufflinks seen in the background footage. Vivian's fixer had not covered his tracks entirely. The tide turned from whisper to exposure. The media ran pieces about procedural lapses and alleged sabotage. The city thirsted for scandal, but this time the story had two poles, one of betrayal, one of vindication. When the jury finally took a vote, they chose to advance Sasha to the final evaluation on the condition that she provide a fresh, sealed sample under direct supervision. She did so with a head that did not droop. She did so with hands that had learned to steady themselves. The final judging was a measured, slow thing. Master Liang, who had the bluntness to admit when he had been fooled, leaned over the sealed vials and sniffed as though each inhalation were his duty. He closed his eyes on Sasha's sample and gave a small nod. When the winners were announced, Sasha's name was called not as a story of pity, but as merit, an arc handled by training and taste. Cameras flashed. Reporters asked her questions about inspiration and technique. Vivian, whose face had been a mask of civility, watched with teeth she kept carefully hidden. Sasha stood on the stage like someone who had been waiting for a door to open and found it had been unlocked. She accepted the judge's comments with the grace of someone who had practiced acceptance as a form of resistance. Her comeback answered questions about restraint, character, and a savoir-faire that had been born of loss. She spoke modestly into Belanquaphone about rain and roofs and the way small things can hold a world. In that moment, the narrative that had wanted to make her a cautionary tale became, at least for a while, an account of singleness and talent redeemed. Adrian watched her from the back, each word a balm and a wound. He wanted to go on stage, to lift her hand and say, "You did it without me," but he did not. He stayed Lynn, folded in attempt and judgment, and felt the cost of the experiment like a cold stone in his gut. His plan had preserved her success, but that preservation had demanded his secrecy. She deserved to choose knowing everything. She also deserved not to be railroaded by his affection. The line between honoring her agency and preserving the integrity of his test was the sharpest part of him.
The night should have ended in simple triumph, but there was a ragged edge to celebration. Vivian did not let a public defeat slide into silence. She moved in long, slow strokes that were always more comfortable in the dark. When the event's attendees flowed toward afterparties, Vivian's fixer lingered near a seam in the hall, the staff entrance, where curtains were thin and a maintenance door opened to a cluster of storage rooms. 2 hours later, a small flame, started low and precise, licked at a pile of discarded paper and shipping crates in a back room where supplies were kept. It was the kind of fire that wanted to be a rumor, a nuisance, manageable, a hazard to be sighed at. It was supposed to create confusion, to draw everyone away from the main hall long enough to let rumors take root. But small fires are talismans of big danger. Paper feeds quickly. A gust of air, the wrong placement of flammable liquids, and the nuisance becomes an inferno. The maintenance staff discovered the smoke too late. Shouts echoed. The hall's emergency alarms trilled. Reporters ran like a school in panic. The crowd flowed toward the exits. Those near the back rooms were trapped by a closed service door that had jammed. Sasha had returned to the stage area, talking to a young admirer who wanted advice about getting into perfumery. When the alarms erupted, she moved to help usher people out, steady and efficient. That instinct to protect was part of what made her a leader in small ways. In the route toward the exits, a staffer shoved a crate too close to a stairwell. Sparks arced. The smoke rolled in like a curtain. Lynn was at the edge of the chaos, his heart iconoclastic with the instinct to act. He shoved through a cluster of frightened people and found, as fate and bad choices align in stories, that someone had been trapped, an intern named May, only 17, who had stayed behind to gather her notes. The service door jammed under a swollen bolt. The smoke thickened and the air tasted of metal. He forced a breath mask from a frightened technician's cabinet and handed it to the intern, then assessed the door with the practical, unemotional urgency of someone who had never been allowed to panic. The door would not budge. He shoved hit wood. It did not open. The fire had already received oxygen and had started pulling air into its hungry throat.
The stairwell behind the door was the only exit for half a dozen workers. In panic, someone shouted, "Break the window!" But the windows were too high and the smoke too thick. The air made everyone clumsy, each move like moving underwater. Lynn turned and saw Sasha at the mouth of the hallway, making decisions. She looked at the locked door, then at him, and something passed between them that required no translation. This was a moment of choosing. "Can you get through?" she asked, voice stripped of the city's armor. He shook his head. "Not this way." "Then we go through another way. Follow me."
Sasha led him down into the bowels of the building, where service corridors folded under the auditorium. The lights were a mosaic of emergency luminance, the smell of smoke sharp as a knife. They found a maintenance hatch that opened onto a narrow duct. It was not intended for people. It was intended for air, for electricity. It was a hazard. It was also a way out. They crawled together through the tight space, tin scraping against ribs, Sasha first with a crate she had seized for extra air pockets, Lynn following, his coat snagging as he moved. The duct narrowed and her sleeve tore on a jagged screw, a streak of dark red painting the fabric. He felt the press of her shoulder against his, as though they had always been used to being that close. The duct opened into a service tunnel that led to the street 3 blocks away, and when they emerged into the rain-slick night, coughing and blinking, they saw smoke pouring from the building's windows and the fire brigade's lights waltzing in sirens. But not everyone had escaped. The cameraman, the man who had been planted to catch the fixer, had been in the back room, and an array of crates and collapsing beams kept him pinned. Someone shouted for aid. Lynn, Adrian, did not hesitate. He shouted back. Where? He had the physicality of a man trained in controlled violence, a bodyguard who knew leverage and risk. He tore open a side door and charged in. Sasha wanted to follow. She fought with the urge to stay and the need to stay, to help and to be helped. Go, she told him. Get the cameraman out. He took the command like a gift and moved. The fire had found grooves. Heat wrapped around him like an invisible hand. He felt himself burn with an intimacy that is only truly felt when you risk your skin for someone's life. He found the cameraman pinned beneath a collapsed rig, face smudged with soot, camera still in hand like a talisman. Lynn rigged together a strap and levered the beam with something close to a prayer of muscle. He felt the beam give. He dragged the man free, hearing the crackle of flame behind his shoulders. As they emerged from the smoky maw, coughing, the cameraman reached for Lynn's hand with a look of raw gratitude and, absurdly, humanly, recognition. He had seen Lynn before, in the peripheries of events. In the way that memory is both precise and fuzzy, he clutched Lynn's sleeve and muttered, "You saved my footage." His voice was hoarse and grateful. For a beat, the world revolved around evacuation. Paramedics sorted the injured, reporters filmed, and the fire brigade managed the flames. Then, as things calmed, someone in the crowd, a man who had worked the building for years, called out, "Security footage, someone needs to check the cameras in the back alley." Daniel had been watching from the edge of the chaos, a statue of fear and calculation. He saw the cameraman dragged out, saw Lynn, saw Adrian's face half hidden in soot, and felt the knot in his chest constrict.
He knew 2 things at once: that the footage would show the fixer in his work, and that it would also include a low-resolution clip of a man in a plain jacket helping save a life. That clip might be what cleared Sasha and damned who had tried to ruin her, but it might also be the first clear image of the man who had been pretending to be poor. The experiment's veil was a fragile thing already. Smoke, applause, and gratitude would shred it if allowed. At the makeshift triage, Sasha sat on an overturned crate, a towel around her shoulders. She had smoke in her hair and a scrap of soot on her cheek shaped like a comma. She watched Lynn with something like a sober awe. He had cuts on his hands. His jacket was singed at the sleeve. He moved like a man for whom risk had been a currency long past used up. She reached out and touched his hand, calloused, warm, and shaking. "You shouldn't have done that," she said softly. "I couldn't not," he replied. Words wedged themselves between people like ladders. He had risked his anonymity and his experiment to save lives. He had chosen action over evidence. Sasha's hand squeezed his with a small, fierce grip that felt like a verdict. As the camera swept the scene, the footage from the back alley camera, the one Daniel had worried about, played on a reporter's phone for anyone close enough to see. It showed a man in a plain jacket manhandling a beam, pulling someone free, leading them to safety. The resolution was poor, but the silhouette and the gait were recognizable to those who knew the subtle intimacy of long years. The way he walked, the manner he held a strap, the small habit of pushing hair behind his ear in concentration. Word spread swiftly. A clip of the rescuer went viral. Handsome in soot, eyes fierce, his jacket still clinging to singed fabric. The caption implied a homeless hero. Sympathetic hearts flooded the feeds. But the internet is never content to let ambiguity stand. Someone recognized the gait as similar to a security video from a corporate gala, Daniel's quick edit, shared for charity. The name began to surface like a slow leak. Fans and fools speculated.
Comments called him Lin. Others called him a mystery man. The more curious minds asked if a wealthy man could be risking his public image in such a way. The next morning, the paper that loved spectacle ran a blurred close-up with a caption asking the question the city had been pressing in hushed prose. Who was the rescuer in a plain jacket? A subsidiary column offered an answer. A man they claimed saw him at several charity events, standing with a new face. The paper loved its cliffhangers. It loved rumors more. When the footage reached a level of viral curiosity that threatened Adrian's experiment, Daniel made a decision that had the flavor of both preservation and surrender.
He walked to the chairman of the Grand Accord and offered the grainy footage along with a partial transcription of the courier timestamps that linked the fixer with Vivian's people. He framed it not as an exposé of Adrian Long, but as evidence that there had been coordinated sabotage. "Whoever he is," Daniel said, "he saved a life. He helps this case as a witness." The chairman accepted the footage, his face a plate of old dignity and new fears. The district attorney's office, which had been monitoring the event for any signs of corruption, picked up the case. The fixer was identified by his cufflink pattern on clip and by a receipt Daniel had found, an espresso cup marked with the fixer's initials. The net tightened. Vivian, seeing the lawyerly recoil of institutions, pivoted. There was a front-page op-ed denouncing the mania of the online masses. There were denials and disclaimers. She made a public statement condemning arson and promising that her people were cooperating. In the quiet between the noise, the fixer tried to slip from town, but a checkpoint caught him, and a police squad on the lookout found the lighter and the small canister used to sustain the flame. His arrest looked almost professional in its clinical neatness. As the police questioned him, the fixer's testimony cracked under the weight of pressure and the knowledge of a camera that had captured his hands. He named names. No grand conspiracy, just a chain of rewards and favors orchestrated around a woman who wanted a rival out of her market. Vivian's name did not always appear in his statements, but enough threads led back to her social circle to warrant investigation. Public perception, ever the jury of the moment, started to shift. And in the midst of the shifting, a quiet thing happened that would decide the next break between Catherine's inference and a truth. Sasha went to see the man in the suit who'd saved the cameraman. She wanted to look at him properly, not through a press lens. In a hospital alcove, where Lin sat bandaging a cut on his forearm that had been given by charred rebar, Sasha's eyes finally found him without the interference of the experiment. "You were there," she said simply. "I was," he answered. Smoke had left its mark on him. The coat smelled faintly of firefighting foam, and something else, her own scent, clinging like a memory. "You could have saved yourself," she said. "I would save myself sometimes to save others," he answered. And the line had more truth to it than either of them liked to admit. "I was supposed to be a test. That doesn't mean I can't act like a man." "Are you Lin?" she asked, that central question that had kept their lives entangled. It was a soft, practical query. Was he the man the world was calling hero, or the mystery figure, or the wealthy man he had once seemed to be at Evelyn Gu's wedding? He inhaled. The moment felt like a precipice.
He could keep the experiment, salvage the truth for his own learning, and let her pick him in a life that remained unblessed by the knowledge of the hand that had skewed her lottery. Or he could end it. He had promised he would give her the right to choose, to pick him with eyes open. That promise had become too expensive in people's lives to hold like a private jewel. He pulled back the torn cuff of his sleeve, revealing an old surgical scar that ran across his wrist, an odd, private mark he had not expected to show. He said, "My name is Adrian Long." He did not preface it with a defense. He let the silence roll over them like a wave. Sasha's face shifted with rapid and complicated motions. Surprise, anger, betrayal, understanding, disbelief. She stood up as though to flee, and then sat down again, not wanting to make a scene in a room that had already tasted too much drama. "You lied," she said. The sentence was an accusation and a plain observation. "I lied," he repeated. "I told myself I would be ethical about it. I told myself I would only observe. But when it mattered, I acted. I stopped other people from being cruel. I had intended to be a poor man for a time to study hearts. It was selfish and arrogant and—" He stopped because he could feel the words rushing him into excuses. "I did it because I was afraid," he finished simply, "of buying affection with my name, of not knowing whether anyone could love me without my title. I am sorry." Sasha's eyes narrowed. "So you tried the world like a fragrance and then decided which notes you liked?" "No." His laugh was a small, broken sound. "I tried to see if what I thought I wanted to measure was even measurable. I wanted to know whether someone would accept me stripped at my name.
I wanted proof I could be chosen. You could have asked. He looked at his hands. I know. That's the part that hurts, she said, voice softer. Not that you wanted to know, but that you decided for me whether I would be tested. He did not deny it. He met her with an honesty that had been hard-won in flame. I know I hurt you. I accept that. If I had one thing to ask, it would be that you look at what I've done to protect you, not just the lie that started it. She watched him for a long time, the rhythm of her breath an argument in itself. She saw the soot in his hair, the raggedness of his clothes, the genuine stitches on his arm where a hand had needed saving. She also remembered the little kindnesses over the weeks, a cup of tea left for her, a scarf bought for the cold, a refusal to take advantage of a discount at her stall. She had seen him refuse to profit when others would have flattered and taken. He had been both experiment and guardian. That duality sat on his shoulders like a child and a burden. When she finally spoke, it was with a clarity he feared. You made a choice for me. I could forgive that more easily if it were only a mistake.
But you kept me from choosing in the most honest way you promised. He bowed his head. I know. I will not ask for forgiveness as a right. I will ask for it as something you can give, if and when you want to. Sasha's silence stretched like a folded paper. She had rebuilt herself from rumor. She did not need another scaffolding. Yet something in his posture, in the exhaustion and the truth of his apology, softened her. She had always been both stubborn and practical. She knew that people change not merely by words, but by what they do afterwards. You can start by telling the truth to the people who matter, she said. Tell your assistant, tell those who kept the experiment. Tell them it failed and why. Then let me decide if I want to be part of the repair. He nodded, the motion like a small forgiveness to himself. They left the hospital and returned to a city lit by emergency lights and a media frenzy that had turned the rescue into myth already. The man in the plain jacket who saved the cameraman and possibly other lives. Social feeds tried to make his story into a brand of its own. Adrian felt himself crumbling under the attention he had wanted to avoid. That night he called Daniel and Mrs. Ong into his study. I will step out of the experiment, he said, simple and cold in its decision. I will tell them I was wrong. Daniel's face hardened into a map of worry and relief. You know what that means, he said. You know how people will see you. I know. He met their eyes. I will take the consequences. The next morning, Adrian Long walked into a press room with a clean suit that had been chosen not for camouflage but for honesty, and said, I have been Lin Wei. I have pretended to be poor to test the hearts of women in this city. He let the sentence sit like a small stone thrown into still water. Reporters rifled papers like hungry birds. Social accounts exploded. The statement was a confession and a rupture. He explained, careful, human, not grandiose, that he had done so out of insecurity, that he had meant to learn something about love but had let fear dictate the method. He admitted the harm his experiment had caused and confessed his intent to repair it. He did not ask for absolution. He asked for understanding that people were messy and could still be better. The city reacted in pieces. Some articles called him a romantic fool whose theatrics bordered on manipulative cruelty. Others painted him as a man trying to escape the strangling expectations of wealth. The legal consequences were muted. No law had been broken by pretending to be poor. The ethical consequences were heaped upon him as opinion pieces and talk show debates. But more important to Sasha was what happened next in the quieter rooms where things are decided by muscle and patience rather than headlines.
When Adrian told his staff to hand over all evidence collected regarding the sabotage, the courier logs, the guard footage, the timestamps, Daniel walked Sasha through the chain of evidence they had assembled. He showed her the grainy clips of the fixer, the receipt mapped to the cafe, the list of people paid to spread the rumor. He showed her the cameraman's footage of the fixer's hands in the alley. Sasha watched with a strange layering of emotions, vindication, relief, the metallic taste of trauma receding. When the district attorney reviewed the case, Vivian's connection to the fixer was not as blatant as a phone call with her name on it, but the chain was professional and long enough to warrant fines and a temporary suspension of her licensing privileges at a business level. The court of public opinion was harsher in its own way. Several partners distanced themselves. Vivian's brand took a hit, and she retreated to nurse wounds in private equity offices where people measure damage with spreadsheets.
Sasha's name was cleared not by one dramatic courtroom moment, but by cumulative work, a combination of Adrian's resources marshaled without fanfare and her own quiet insistence on integrity. The Grand Accord publicly amended its procedures. Prizes were publicly given. Sasha's name became a headline, not for scandal, but for artistry. When the dust settled, Adrian asked Sasha to a quiet lunch in a park where the scent of wet earth made the air feel generous. He had prepared no fancy script. He brought no ring. He gave her the space to respond not to the man who had been Lynn or the man who had been Adrian, but to the person who had saved the cameraman and had turned a test into rescue. "I cannot undo what I did," he said. "All I can do is ask you to look at what I've done since. I can step out of my pride, accept accountability, and ask for the chance to be known for who I am, without pretense." Sasha chewed a small piece of bread and thought. The aroma of her own comeback lingered on her wrist where she had dabbed a little, a memory of what had been at stake. "You had one reason to lie," she said. "Fear." She paused. "But I did say yes to a poor man, if that's what you want to call it. I said yes not because he was poor, but because of the way he treated me. You showed up when you had nothing to gain, and you acted when it looked like the world might burn me out for good." Adrian's answer was a careful intake of breath. "I know I asked you to consent to a lie. I want to undo that by giving you the truth and then expecting nothing." Sasha looked at him for a long time. She weighed ego and apology like a perfumer weighs notes. She chose not to absolve him with a single gesture. Instead, she did something else. She accepted a fragile friendship and the possibility of repair. "I will rebuild with my own hands," she said. "If you want to be part of that, be part of it with your name on it. Not as a test, but as a partner."
He accepted the condition, because it was reasonable and because the whole experiment had been a lesson in humility. He agreed without contest. In the weeks that followed, Sasha's brand received a lifeline, not from Adrian's company's influence, but from a modest investment seeded by a coalition of smaller backers Adrian had introduced to her, shop owners with good noses, a restaurateur who had once praised her second chance sample, and a quiet angel investor who admired grit. Adrian insisted his name be left out of the public filings. The investment was to be from an anonymous private trust that would not taint the narrative. Sasha accepted the funding on her terms, with a clause about creative control that she insisted on like a perfumer insisting on her compass. The industry's reaction was a cocktail of grudging respect and jealous scowls. The Grand Accord expanded its vetting procedures and apologized publicly for any lapses in protocol. Master Lang donated a short scholarship for young noses, something Sasha humbly accepted as a nod to the craft rather than to herself. Adrian, having confessed and risked humiliation, felt oddly lighter. He had lost a little of the pristine distance he had cultivated for years, and in losing it he found something like relief. He attended Sasha's private showcase not as a man conducting a social experiment, but as a partner who had been given permission to stand in the room. Their relationship did not become a fairy tale overnight. They argued about affairs of business, the creative control clause, the authenticity of scent lines, whether to expand into luxury labels or remain bespoke. They argued like two artisans who both loved the craft. He learned patience, not as an exercise in endurance, but as a skill he refined, waiting for consensus, listening before deciding, accepting that trust replaced the ease of unilateral command. He also had to face a family reckoning. His mother, whose opinions had often shaped boardroom decisions, called him into a conversation that mixed scolding and a tentative pride. "You made a mess," she said bluntly, "but you stepped into it." She was not a woman quick to forgive, but she gave him a small practical blessing, to be careful and to be honest with himself. Evelyn Gu's scandal drifted into the background. The social ladder rearranged itself as it always did. The Wong family dealt with the fallout inwardly. Vivian retreated and then reappeared in smaller circles, her sharpness not softened but redirected at less public targets. The city's gossip churned, but for Sasha and Adrian, the essential work had begun in unlikely places. In late-night sample trials, in tender arguments about bottle design, and in the daily rituals of someone deciding to be present. The perfume contest, which had been both weapon and vindication, shaped Sasha's career into something more durable. She opened a small atelier with a modest front store that smelled of herbs and rain and ambition. Her comeback line became the core of an offering that resisted explosive growth in favor of steady regard. Her first investor, a businesswoman who had once been a harsh critic, became a mentor who taught her how to pitch without losing craft. Adrian created a seed program within Long Industries to support small creative businesses, an act that was part repentance, part pragmatic philanthropy. He insisted on a selection committee that included artistic directors and not only financial officers. The initiative was publicly lauded as a sign of corporate conscience, but privately it was Adrian's way of making a structural change for talent who might otherwise be trampled. Their romance, when it rekindled into something more than apologies, was careful and not theatrical. They met in Sasha's tiny atelier to test accords. They shared lunches where conversation turned from business to small absurdities, the exact brand of soap they preferred, whether one should buy new notebooks or reuse old ones, the way a good cup of tea could solve small administrative crisis. Intimacy came in the form of shared mundane things, the unlaced shoe tied without comment, the willingness to bring an umbrella on a morning with an improbable forecast. The city watched the arc with the hungry eye of a spectator. Some called it a redemption narrative, some a romantic drama, others a warning. But for Sasha and Adrian, the drama had folded into the texture of life. He asked for second chances and worked for them. She accepted with limits. They pledged slowly to be honest about what they had been and what they would be. A year later, the small boutique that once smelled only of second chance and noodle broth had a modest expansion. An upstairs lab, a small staff of trained noses, and a line shelf that gleamed like a row of small rites. Adrian attended the opening with a plain bouquet of white roses that smelled of soft green leaves, and he asked, in a quiet way, if she would consider something more official. This time, his question carried no pretense of testing. It carried furniture, a willingness to let her continue building on her terms, and an invitation to build something together, both in life and in work. He proposed not with flourish, but with a stone ring he said matched the bass note in her current composition. Simple, honest, intentional. No tests, he said, only choices. Sasha laughed, a short sound, like relief. She only ever wanted to be chosen with knowledge and mutual pursuit. She said yes to that, not to the man's title or his money, but to the person who had unmasked himself and then spent himself in steady repair. The city's final verdict came in a surprise column that wrote not of scandal, but of the small things that sustain people. Charity begun by a man who had once been afraid, a perfumer whose art had endured rumor, and a story that refused a tidy moral. The Grand Accord instituted better protections.
Vivian's brand found new direction, humbled if not wholly reformed. The fixer, now facing legal consequences, was a footnote in the broader narrative, a demonstration of how easy cruelty can be when people are allowed to behave as props. Epilogue, as neat as anyone can make it. Sasha's line prospered, slowly and with care. She opened a training scholarship for young noses whose families could not afford academy tuition. Funding came from the coalition Adrian had helped convene. Adrian changed his company's approach to influence. He reformed sponsorship programs and directed a small fund to mentorship rather than patronage. They married in a private ceremony in a greenhouse, where scent ruled and suits were optional. Instead of a wedding cake catastrophe, there was a gentle spill of flower petals and the smell of wet leaves. Mrs. Ong, who had once called Adrian's experiment worse than burning, and then softened to necessary because you chose to mend it, gave them both a long, practical mothering smile. Daniel, who had been the safety valve of secrets and a man of plain counsel, toasted them with a joke about how he'd never signed up to be a matchmaker. Evelyn Gu grudgingly attended, wearing a hat, and offered only a cold clap that thawed somewhat when Sasha presented her with a small vial of rose-based perfume, a peace offering of craft. The honeymoon was not about islands and extravagance. It was about slow mornings at a cafe that knew Sasha's order, and an office in which they both sat to talk about products and promises. They built a life where the daily test was to be honest, to choose each other without games. In the end, the experiment that began with a lie settled into a lesson. People are not data to be gathered. They are choices to be respected. Adrian had pretended to be poor to test blind dates. He had hoped to discover who would love him when he had nothing. Only a poor, betrayed girl had said yes, not because of his poverty, but because of consistent care, brave acts, and the courage to confess. She had said yes to the man he had shown himself to be after the pretense had been burned away. If this story left you wanting more romantic twists and messy redemptions, leave a comment about which choice surprised you most. Like the video if you enjoyed this telling, and share it with a friend who loves a good, honest drama.